to this evening lecture hosted by the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion. So my name is Mark Harris, I'm the director of the IRC, and it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Dr. Louise Hickman, who will be speaking on the subject Unlikely Stories, how the ancient drama of philosophy can help us think about the non-human world. And I'll say a few words about her in a moment. Just to say that we are recording this, and when we get to the discussion at the end, we'll pass around the handheld microphone, so please wait for that before you start speaking. Also, if you would rather that your contribution, your question or comments were not included in the film, which goes on YouTube, please do let us know, because it can easily be edited out. So Louise is reader in philosophy of religion and the program lead for taught postgraduate theology at Birmingham Newman University. She studied for her first 2 degrees at the University of Exeter and her PhD at the University of Cambridge. She's published on various aspects of the history of philosophy, philosophy of religion, and science and religion. And from 2011 to 2018, she was editor of Reviews and Science and Religion. And Louise is a fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion and a senior fellow of the UK's Higher Education Academy. So Louise, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much. We're delighted to hear your talk. So,
thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. It's great to be invited to be here with you this evening. I'm going to be telling a few stories this evening. So I will start off with one particular story that was told by the 6th century Alexandrian Olympiodorus. And he told a story about a dream that the philosopher Plato had when he was dying. Plato dreamed, we're told, that he was turned into a swan, flying from tree to tree, causing trouble for the hunters. Simmias of Thebes later proffered an interpretation of this dream. Trying to grasp the meaning of Plato's philosophy is like the futile mission of the hunters, because he will always escape those who try to catch him. Interpretation, in this interpretation, is a wild swan chase. The dream within a story troubles anyone who might assume they have the meaning of this dream or of Plato's wider philosophy pinned down. So I begin with this story because I would like to focus on some of the likely tales told to us through the dialogues of Plato. Plato did not just create stories in his dreams. His entire corpus is an interwoven web of story. He is usually remembered principally for his rational argument, but this is threaded together with imaginary tales, mythos and logos, mythical story and reasoned argument, both intertwined in a context of dramatic conversation. As well as containing mythical stories, the dialogues themselves are written as stories, supposed encounters between dramatis personae. The Platonic dialogues leave us not just with stories, but stories within stories, riddles within riddles. When it comes to interpretation, this is not a simple dream, but a veritable hermeneutical interpretative nightmare. So why am I so interested in this particular storyteller from the ancient Greek world? Well, I'll give you a short autobiographical story to explain, because I started with an interest that began with the 18th century, particularly with its ethics and politics and philosophy of religion, looking at how Platonism is a key ingredient of the emerging philosophies of political self-determination and democracy, and to some degree arguments for God's existence. And from there, it was just a case of following the money back to the dialogues themselves. And this wasn't just idle curiosity. It was born of a fascination for how the last century has been one of an out-and-out pylon, really, blaming Plato's philosophy for all manner of things, including logocentrism, phallocentrism, and misogyny. And Karl Popper's critique of Plato is well known, megalomaniac totalitarian, although I am paraphrasing slightly. And recently, Plato has fared no better in theological circles either. David Clough, for example, assumes a fairly neat distinction between the Christian and Platonic traditions, arguing that we must refuse to accept the Neoplatonic hierarchies of value that have been influential on Christian theology. Mark Wallace, in his When God Was a Bird, describes Christianity as becoming a vassal to the dualistic hierarchies of Plato and Aristotle, who saw what is animal and mineral as soulless, starkly divided from human beings. These are just two examples of fierce recent critics, but there are many, many more. What has struck me on my journey back to Plato more than anything is that the common portrayal of Platonic philosophy as dualist, anti-democratic, politically hierarchical, anti-poetry and anti-drama, this might be true of Platonism, which indicates the canonical way of interpreting the dialogues, but it doesn't really quite ring true in any straightforward way of Plato and his dialogues. Instead, I think what we have with Plato is a puzzle that we've forgotten is a puzzle. We have myth, rational argument, parody, irony, and much, much more. For somebody with a received account of interpretation, he does go a long way to make sure that he's misunderstood. In appreciating this puzzle for what it is, I think we can perhaps see something of ourselves reflected back to us in the received interpretations, and we can become better able to challenge the assumptions behind the philosophical traditions that we so often accept without thinking. Much is lost, I suggest, if we do not appreciate the puzzle we have in front of us. What has all this got to do with the non-human world? This evening, I will focus on some of Plato's stories about animals, and this will draw attention to some of the elements of the Platonic corpus that are usually overlooked, myth and animals, including the study of animals through myth. And through doing this, I would like to suggest that Plato's philosophy offers a useful point of reflection to think about the human and non-human animal, as well as the role of literature and story more generally in our relationship with non-human animals. So another picture of a swan now, and another story of a swan. It's another story, this time from Plato's Phaedo dialogue. And this dialogue is set in prison, where the character Socrates awaits his death by hemlock. This is often taken to be an attempt to prove the immortality of the soul in this dialogue, justifying Socrates' lack of fear in his own imminent demise. Before the rational arguments are presented, however, we're told Socrates becomes a swan. He declares, "I think that I am myself a fellow servant of the swans, and am consecrated to the same God." In his dying speech, his swan song, Socrates laments the facts that swans are misunderstood by humans because we say they sing their best song, one of sorrow, when they face death. However, no bird, Socrates observes, not even the nightingale or swallow, sings in lamentation, or when it is hungry or cold. The swans do not sing for grief, we are told, but rather they sing for joy because of the blessings to come. In ancient Greece, birds were messengers of the gods, given by the gods to impart truth. Swans were the servants of Apollo, and as such were thought to have his gift of prophetic vision. Furthermore, the swans exemplify the fusion of prophecy and poetry, as Apollo was also the god of both music and poetry. This means that poets become swans when they are taken out of their minds with divine inspiration, we're told, as do prophets and givers of oracles. Swan poets are also truth bearers. In Plato's Meno, those inspired by the divine prophetic power not only speak beautifully, but also speak the truth. And in the Phaedo, swans sing the truth, and truth passes through them, we're told. In this dialogue, Socrates becomes a bird in order to share their prophetic and poetic ability to philosophize and speak truth. Andrea Capra, in her account, calls this an ornithology, a curious mix of both bird ethology, because Socrates had clearly studied the behaviour of birds, and theology, as both Socrates and the swans are attendants of the god Apollo, and they are both unafraid of death because of this. And this tells us something, I think, about logos, myth, and truth. The swan poet Socrates conveys truth through myth, not logos, on this particular occasion. In the Phaedo, Socrates goes on to present an argument for the immortality of the soul, but in the dialogue, this tells us less than what the swans already know. We are told that sure knowledge of immortality lies beyond our reach, even though the swans already sing of it. Despite the limits of human knowledge, Socrates claims his impending death makes it appropriate for him to examine his belief, to try to provide the most convincing account of life after death. An account of transmigration ends the first part of the dialogue, but it is not accepted by the dialogue's interlocutors, so Socrates has to, as he puts it, start again. And in starting again, he compares himself to the swan. He tells a likely story based loosely on what the poets say of another earth above ours. This other earth is beautiful with no disease, and there are many animals as well as humans. The sun, moon, and stars are seen as they really are, and the gods converse, sharing prophecies and visions. The earth is cyclical, continually in flux. Streams flow in and out of underground caverns. The water, air, and wind oscillate like breath. Streams flow into rivers, make marshes, rivers, and springs, but then go back under the earth, passing round in a circle. The souls of the dead go to an underground lake to face judgment and get their due. But this process is primarily one of change. Those souls that can be cured of wrongdoing are purified, and most souls are sent back to be born again. In this dialogue, the message we seem to be told is one of care. If the soul is immortal, Socrates says, then we must care for it, not only in respect to this time, which we call life, but in respect to all time. If death was an escape from this world, it would be a boon to the wicked, Socrates says, but they cannot get away so easily. The only way to escape evil is to become good, which means we should care for the soul by doing all we can to acquire virtue and wisdom. This eschatological myth, the last one that Socrates weaves from his deathbed, ends in skepticism. It would not be fitting, Socrates says, for a man of sense to believe everything is as he describes it. However, we can, he suggests, venture to believe something like it. Furthermore, the sensible person ought to repeat such things as if they were magic charms. It is too much of a stretch, therefore, to say the purpose of the dialogue is to provide some sort of rational philosophical argument in search of proof of life after death. It is rather enchantment. Stories cast spells, and according to Socrates, we must charm ourselves so that we seek a life of wisdom and virtue. Socrates' swan song is therefore both a prophetic and poetic myth. It charms us into reflection on the ethical life. In summary, the Phaedo's contemplation of the soul's immortality actually repudiates escape from this world. Philosophy is enchantment. The dialogue's ornithology sees Socrates as poetic philosopher, mythmaker, by virtue of his becoming a swan. And his swan nature guarantees his status as philosopher. One really important thing to note here is the indispensability of myth. Myths saturate the Platonic corpus, and Socrates himself is presented as the master mythmaker. However, it's only really since the 21st century that the Platonic myths have been taken in any way seriously as part of his philosophy. Typically ignored or dismissed as optional literary filling in favour of the more serious, proper philosophical argument, myth has typically been made subservient to rational argument. And this is not surprising given Plato is so dismissive of the traditional Greek myths of the gods, goddesses, heroes, and monsters, levelling at them accusations of childish play and trivial entertainment. However, Julia Annas is one who is right that there are no good grounds for assuming that Plato thought his own philosophical myths to be trivial or a dispensable part of the dialogue. And Catherine Morgan offers a nuanced and, in my view, largely persuasive account of how we should see Platonic mythos, or myth, as impossible to define and also impossible to distinguish sharply from logos. Crucially, Catherine Morgan sets the development of Platonic myth into the context of the development of writing. The age of the pre-Socratics and then Plato, she says, saw a shift in Greece from the majority oral to a majority written culture. And this shift coincides with the emergence of concepts of mythology, philosophy, and rhetoric. The distinction between mythos and logos was not one that would have been recognized by the archaic Greeks, for their myth was characterized by undemonstrable truth and poetic authority. Associated with this form of authority, truth tended to be asserted, not demonstrated. Gradually, the development of written texts acted as a spur to a greater conceptual abstraction and meditation on the nature of language. Philosophers, including Heraclitus and Xenophanes, believe language had been misused by the earlier poets and their mythological tradition. Morgan describes a desire to correct this misuse in the pre-Socratics through a new binary system in which myth is contrasted with abstract philosophical thinking. A refusal to accept the authority and convention of myth introduces questions of the truth or falsity of language. Prior to this, the opposite of truth is just forgetfulness. But with the development of philosophical thinking, truth and falsehood become a binary tied to the problem of language. Philosophy then resulted in different forms of discourse, mythos and logos, which go on to spark reflection on the limits and possibilities of these forms of discourse. When we turn to Plato, we see a reaction against the authority of Homer and Hesiod and a refusal to accept convention as authoritative. And crucially, Plato does not reject mythos. In Plato's text, the word mythos has wide usage, extending from Homer's lying tales about the gods to teleology, cosmology, and other technical theorizing. It is associated with leisure, play, also childishness, but so too is philosophy associated with these things. Often what makes mythos philosophical rather than childish is its connection to philosophical argument. Myths are often introduced after philosophical discussion, and sometimes myth helps the interlocutors turn people towards philosophy. In the hands of Socrates, the myths spark questions and encourage learning. This is in contrast to the sophists' use of myth, which is orientated principally towards control. Morgan puts it that whereas dialectic aims at the abstract and the objective, myth continually returns us to the particular and the subjective. Of particular significance is that although mythos and logos might seem to be divided and opposed, this division is always unstable and fluid. And this fluid nature of mythos and logos is widely apparent. Sometimes, so for example in the Laws and the Republic, it doesn't seem to matter whether an account is called a mythos or a logos. The famous ideal state of the Republic is called a mythos, whereas the Egyptian myth of the invention of writing, when it's retold in the Phaedrus, is not. Socrates accepts that his account of the fate of the soul in the Gorgias can be called either a mythos or a logos according to one's point of view. In the Timaeus, another very famous myth of the lost city of Atlantis is described as a strange but true logos, whereas the Timaeus' cosmology is called a likely mythos. After that discussion, it is suggested that all philosophical accounts are in some sense mythical. And the Phaedo, as we've already seen, interweaves myth and logos. And Socrates initially glosses his mythologizing about immortality as rational inquiry, and then it's after that that he begins again as a swan. If we look on a bigger scale, Platonic dialogues as a whole are often dialectical, and yet at the same time they remain in story form or mythos. And this fluidity highlights how attention to the holistic context is paramount. The material often functions differently in different contexts, which means the search for a concrete definition of mythos or logos, or any schema for how Plato distinguishes them, is absolutely futile. The meaning is changeable and unstable because language is always embedded in a holistic context. So I would like to venture this evening that this muddling of the distinction between mythos and logos, story and rational argument, reminds us, the readers of the dialogues, of four particularly important things. At first, the use of myth encourages us to have greater appreciation for the importance of context. Myth serves these different purposes in different contexts. So as we've seen, sometimes it might complete rational argument, sometimes it's an alternative to rational argument, and sometimes it's a precursor to this argument. And although these are written texts, we are reminded through the drama of the dialogues that speech is much more than just a verbal communication. It's also highly contextual. The conversation partners, the setting that they are in, the body language, what has happened previously, and sometimes in the Platonic dialogues, even the amount of alcohol consumed, is crucial for the context and the ensuing discussion. Second, the dramatic dialogue form makes it difficult to abstract meaning. The hunters of Plato's dying dream in trying to trap a firm meaning, while any interpretation is only ever a still and silent image of the living original. The conversation never stands still and is never brought to a conclusive, satisfactory end. It is, as Howland puts it, animal in form, alive. Each inquiry can only be completed by the reader's own reflection upon the variety of perspectives from which, having entered the dialogues as an active participant, he has then investigated the issue at hand. Third, myth helps us to appreciate the insights above because it is so self-evidently ambiguous. We cannot fail to have doubt and uncertainty, or to use the Greek term, we cannot fail to have aporia, or puzzlement. Aporia runs through many of these purported conversations in Plato's dialogues. Some end in aporia about what, for example, knowledge, holiness, friendship, or courage actually are. A concrete answer is never found. In other dialogues, mythos embeds aporia, introducing them at times when the logical reasoning has just run aground. That such myths cannot be interpreted with confidence puts the problem of interpretation front and centre. As Morgan puts it, it helps to keep the philosophers honest. A gap between language and truth is opened up, and this tends to be the space in which both mythos and logos operate. We are thus reminded of the limits of knowledge and discourse, while dogmatism is always refused. The result of this is that we are spurred on continuously to consider the authority we give to conventional beliefs and to seek better knowledge and fuller wisdom. Fourth, and finally, setting mythos in the drama of the dialogue with all of its ambiguity and contingency is part of an invitation to us, the reader, to philosophize. The dialogues are obviously not meant to record history, but to get us to think for ourselves about the philosophical questions portrayed by, as Drew Hyland puts it, by thinking into a given situation. That these stories are an integral part of an invitation to philosophize means that they are inherently participatory. The reader is invited to participate, just like the characters, taking into consideration a range of different perspectives. This makes philosophy, as Kevin Corrigan puts it, a form of collaborative lived community experience. Furthermore, there is transformation in the dialogue partners. So writing philosophy through dramatic dialogue reminds us of this particular insight. One more myth for us. It is perhaps the most ironic twists in the works of a philosopher famed for his irony that Plato writes a critique of writing through a mythical character spoken by the character Socrates. In the Phaedrus dialogue, Socrates tells us, he says, of a story I heard. And this implies it's a pre-existent myth, but actually this seems to be a story that Plato invented. We are told that the Egyptian god, Theoth, invents writing and presents it to the superior deity and king, Thamus, seeking approval for its general rollout across the Egyptian population. He claims that writing is a charm or elixir. The Greek word is pharmakon. It's a charm, he says, because it will make the Egyptians more intelligent and will give them better memories. But Thamus is less than impressed by this presentation. For starters, he quips that although Theoth may have been ingenious to make the invention, no one person can assess the benefits or harms of their innovations. It takes another to do this. So philosophy is depicted as more of a team sport rather than an individual endeavour. Thamos then explains this so-called charm is in fact the opposite. It will atrophy the memory and consequently give people only the illusion of intelligence rather than the real thing. It is therefore not an elixir or a remedy, but actually the opposite of this. It is a poison. Pharmakon is a Janus word because it is one that has a double meaning when both meanings are opposite to one another. And the Greek language, like many other ancient languages, was just full of these words with double meanings. Pharmakon can be translated as remedy or poison. It can be something good or bad. And as with our word drug, whether it's one thing or the other depends on a whole catalogue of different things, all dependent on the holistic system of which it is a part. This could be the dosage, the person taking it, the circumstances, including interactions with other drugs or environmental factors. Remedies can be turned into poisons or vice versa, depending on the wider system. They are thoroughly contextual and cannot be understood or assessed when separated from this context or system. So the knowledge of whether something is a drug or poison or remedy is then held within the relationship between the thing and the system. A drug or a pharmakon can be one thing and the opposite of that at the same time. And the interpretation of the word pharmakon in this case, or the meaning of the story as a whole, cannot be assessed when separated from the context. And we don't know if that should be the context of this particular dialogue, the dialogues as a whole, etc. So along with other oral traditions that are replete with stories, this pharmakon story suggests that we should look at the world more holistically. A firm distinction between medicine and poison is difficult to maintain in a holistic worldview. In this particular mythos, I think we see Plato wrestling with this shift from an oral to a written culture, reflecting on what is lost in that transition and reflecting on whether writing is the elixir, remedy, or poison. Writing makes some of the most valuable elements of speech and story further removed from the context or the original conversation. So the communal nature, its responsiveness, its ability to flex to the intended audience tend to become further removed from the speech where it originated. Writing is therefore an imitation of speech, not as pure as the original. Written words cannot take part in a living conversation. They are not alive and animalistic in the way that spoken dialogue is. They are not open-ended, but open and shut, because you can close a book or a piece of writing and move on. Writing is far less participatory. There's less opportunity for two-way consensus-building conversation. In the dialogue, we are thus invited into the conversation to reflect on this shift to a written culture and what might be lost. Writing tends to pin down. It often tries to abstract meaning, and it tends towards what is fundamentally extractive and abstractive. The indigenous philosopher Tyson Yunkaporta highlights the difference between oral cultures, which are high context, with all thinking dependent on the holistic context. They tend to seek patterns and relationships. These tend to be very different from print-based cultures, he said, that are often low context because they have a habit of focusing on ideas and objects in isolation. Drawing attention to the limits of writing helped to inoculate against these particular limits. In response, I think this calls us to pay more attention to the context and function of narrative. An appreciation of contextuality helps us to appreciate the innate instability of words and stories. Myths can be both the poison and remedy, as can fancy speeches, along with language and writing. The apparatic, puzzled nature of myth and the drama of philosophy therefore reminds us that writing, like likely stories, tell us something, but at the same time they also omit things. Likely stories, however, make this omission more obvious. We know that we are not meant to take them literally. We must therefore go back to the written word and to other forms of knowing, much more conscious of what, and I would also suggest who, we leave out. This will make us more aware of how writing and textualization tends to make stories less participatory. And more recently, work in both disability studies and animal literature has drawn attention to the way in which textuality can be exclusory. Narratology, used in social science research, especially in life story research and narrative identity studies in areas like health and medicine, can sometimes exclude body language and other ways of telling, and they can put those with communicative disabilities at a disadvantage. So some of the work in disability literature has drawn attention to this. When it comes to the non-human world, textuality makes it even harder to see how the non-human might be part of the human story. If, as people like John Hort and Celia Dean Drummond have proposed, evolution can be seen as a story, then I would like to ask, what role does the non-human world play in co-creating this story and in interpreting it? So I think we should try to reach for a fuller participation of the non-human world in the stories that we tell. I think the drama of the dialogues can help us recognise aporia and the ongoing nature of our endeavour to philosophise in as participatory a way as possible. The dialogue form, I think, encourages us to think about the interconnected nature of mythos and logos, story and philosophy, and the need for both to be participatory. The metaphor of drama and the living animalistic nature of it means that no inquiry can ever be completed. And to strive to be fuller, it needs to take more fully into account the perspectives of those who are often omitted. How, therefore, can we enable this participation to be as broad as possible, especially when it comes to the non-human world? How can we include that non-human world in the stories that we tell about it? Well, I think to begin with, we can certainly aim at being better vicarious storytellers. I think we can recognise the capacity for the non-human world to participate in the various stories that we tell. Or at least we need to recognise aporia, doubt, puzzlement at the assumption that it cannot. We know recent work in disability studies have shown us that stories are always a joint activity. Even those vicarious stories, they are co-constructed by several tellers. And in telling stories about the non-human world, therefore, I think one model is to see ourselves as constructing narratives vicariously. And this means we should try to be the best vicarious storytellers we can. I think in doing this, there is a role for textual literature, despite the criticisms raised by Plato of writing. I think this is because a lot of textual literature can sort of develop our own creative imagination. In our textual culture, we've often assumed that animals can't participate in our storytelling, and that any attempt to think that they might is anthropocentric. There's a question in literary studies at the moment, which is becoming very pressing, which is the question, how can we be true to animal experience through the medium of writing? What underpins this question is often a perceived gap between the human and non-human. So we could collapse the gap on the one hand, but this means that animals get subsumed and become mere metaphors. And we can see this, for example, in 18th century retellings of Aesop's fables, in which the animals just become stand-ins for some element of human behaviour. And the story itself becomes very much focused on the human in the centre of that tale. Another example of that collapsing of the gap is the 18th century writer Francis Coventry, who wrote a book, The Adventures of Pompey the Little, in 1751, about a lapdog. And this lapdog gives the author's observations of a different human life. And it purports to be from the dog's perspective, but clearly there isn't really any real attempt to think through what the dog's perspective might be. The dog just becomes the mouthpiece for the human. And there's an obvious concern there about anthropomorphism and also anthropocentrism. The other literary option, which is sometimes taken, is to try to maintain the gap between the human and the non-human rather than collapse it. But often that gap becomes some sort of unabridgeable abyss in comprehension between them. So to avoid anthropomorphizing, we mustn't try to project any human emotions or human ideas onto the non-human animal. This form of literature presents the animal naturalistically, or tries to be more scientific, presenting the animals in a way typical of their particular species. But this is often seen to miss the mark because it doesn't really quite capture our experience of animals in reality, because we tend to attribute to them some sort of world or a life, some sort of inner sensibility, as Kate Soper puts it. I think it is possible for written stories to move us beyond these stark alternatives, however, sort of taking into consideration some of Plato's critiques about writing. I think stories can play an important role in helping us make an imaginative leap. If we see this literature through the lens of Plato's critique of writing, we can be aware of its limits, or aporia, while at the same time allowing for it to shift our conventional thinking. We can see stories as both true and not true at the same time. And by encouraging us to shift our thinking, I think a good story can help to further the philosophical conversation. So this is now moving on to my more playful part of this talk, because I would like to suggest that David Duchovny's novella Holy Cow is perhaps an example of how this might work. And this is a story, if you don't know it, about Elsie, which is written from the cow's perspective as she escapes from the farm and goes on all sorts of adventures with her friends, who are a turkey and a pig. And the absurdity and humour of this puts aporia front and centre. It's very different from the story of the lapdog. So through aporia, we are challenged to at least accept that we do not know all of the conscious life of non-human beings. We're also encouraged to shift our view ethically as well, particularly in relation to factory farming. The storyteller here is obviously vicarious, but space is created to invite us into the philosophical reflection that unsettles conventional thinking. We are reminded of what we do not know and where we should tread carefully in our assumptions. And I think it's no coincidence that Elsie the cow was also the mascot of the Borden Dairy Company, who invented the rotary milking parlour. So in 1936, this company, the marketing department of this company, invented stories about the cow Elsie, who symbolised the perfect dairy product, as they put it. And this Elsie had all sorts of seemingly lovely adventures told through advertising storyboards just to maximise dairy sales. And there's no attempt here to promote the idea of aporia or puzzlement. It's just assumed that we could understand the inner life of this Elsie. So these two tales, or the tale of two Elsies, are very different in the way that they handle the account of non-human animals. I think they can show us how literature can act certainly either as remedy or poison for the factory-farmed cows. And these two stories also highlight the unavoidably ethical nature of story. So vicarious storytelling, I would suggest, carries an enormous ethical responsibility. In their discussions of migration narratives, Gaboa and Sommer have shown us that when it's done well, it can encourage a better understanding of the experiences of those at the centre. It can raise awareness, make lived experiences more accessible to others, and can often foster empathy. Literary narratives thus have the potential to challenge oppressive practices and power structures. But these authors also ask a pertinent question. Under what circumstances does advocacy lead to empowerment? And in what situations does it actually have the opposite effect, increasing marginalisation? So these stories can be elixir, remedy, or also poison. Giving a voice to the voiceless can often reproduce the power relations that have made the subject voiceless to begin with. In vicarious storytelling, we therefore have a responsibility to recognise this and to mitigate against it. And this should be, I think, a question continually asked of stories and literature of the non-human. For example, those that use non-human animals merely as metaphors for the human tend to obliterate the non-human and then reinforce exploitative power relations. Asking Gaboa and Sommer's question of literary animal narratives, does the narrative reinforce marginalisation? I think would be a more fruitful question than merely asking, does a story anthropomorphise? Another way to put it is whether we are telling, or another way to put the question is whether we are telling a story of the non-human world or for the non-human world. Ambiguity, aporia, and its open-ended invitation to philosophize therefore opens us up to search for new ways of knowing, to seek an ever-expanding circle of participants, which encourages us to be better vicarious storytellers for the non-human world. I think, however, we might go further than purely vicarious storytelling. And we might recognise that, in fact, the non-human world has always been telling part of the story. It does, in fact, have the capacity to participate in story making. And this has to be true simply because we are so intertwined with the non-human world. And it has been a fundamental mistake over history, I think, to assume that they are not, or that we are not intertwined with that non-human world. So I find Susan McHugh's work is helpful here. She looks at narrative histories of companion species relations and documents how our narratives have been affected by the animal. She shows how animals have real social agency and they have been causal agents in literature. This, together with the interspecies links or the impossibility of separating species, means that non-human animals have had a role in shaping not just literature, but also the sciences and wider human life. McHugh calls her approach a narrative ethology, emphasizing the relevance of the humanities to the study of species in the life sciences. She explains how narrative practice and research defies disciplinary divisions of knowledge. We need to bring together, she says, complex and different constructions of and methods for studying with animals. Affective theory thus emphasizes our context and our embeddedness in our environments and the impossibility of seeing ourselves as individuals. Having recognised the capacity for the non-human world to shape human narrative and to be an active agent in story creation, I think we can then create more space for this, and we must listen more attentively. Gebauer and Sommer, in their work on migration narratives, suggest a longer-term goal should be to move beyond vicarious storytelling, to enable those currently voiceless to speak for themselves and to encourage others to listen more carefully. In their work providing opportunities for migrants to share their stories, they demonstrate the imperative of treating migrants not as petitioners, but as experts. So this has led me to wonder how the non-human world would also be considered an expert in the co-telling of our stories. In answering this question, I think we can be guided by indigenous ways of thinking, in which the non-human has always been part of the community of story making. To hear what's being said, we will need to stop, spend time, and listen. Plants, Robin Wall Kimmerer reminds us, tell their stories not by what they say, the sounds they make, but by what they do. They have no language, so they dance what they want to say, she says. They tell it in their every movement. Centering the non-human world repositions it, not merely as petitioner in a vicarious narrative, but as expert storyteller. Kimmerer, again, says plants teach in the universal language of food, a language that all animals, including human, can understand. And this, she says, is a very different story from one of linear uniformity, efficiency, and the maximization of yields for the purpose of the market. The plants teach us reciprocity and mutual flourishing. And to learn this lesson, an important form of deep listening is vital. To articulate this a little bit more, I will mention the poet and creative writer Elizabeth Jane Burnett, because I think she further articulates how co-participation might work in written literature. In her most recent work, 12 Words for Moss, she tells the story of devising alternative names through poetry for the various mosses that she encounters. It is the story of degradation and the part restoration of peat bogs, but also a story about grief and friendship. She explains how she feels the need to provide her own alternative names because the scientific Linnean labels are only a small part of a much bigger task of knowing. When naming plants, she says, the Linnean system of taxonomy aimed to name in abstraction, and it replaced the native names. And by doing this, it got rid of the context of these names, including the medicinal uses, information about biogeographical distribution, she says, and cultural meaning. Furthermore, she says, of utmost significance is that the Linnean names are not the names the mosses would choose for themselves. Our scientific naming alone is insufficient because the mosses know themselves, and this is a point she borrows from Robin Wall Kimmerer. On one particular occasion when writing the book, Burnett goes along with some scientists on a research trip to a peat bog, and she recalls this particular encounter. She says that amid the immediacy of the practical concerns, there is no moment of quiet. There is no space to stop and wait for the moss. Someone hands me a head of Sphagnum capillifolium and tells me it's a sphagnum. I have learned a great deal from the scientists, what sphagnum mosses look like, their relationship to peat, how and why to restore a peat bog, but this gift, she says, seems superfluous, like handing back a Shakespeare sonnet and saying, it's a poem. I accept it, but press it down back among the mosses. So she asks us, as you can see, what more could we be sharing here, the scientists and the poets? And Burnett's renaming is born of her attempt to try to think about this question and also to wait for the moss, responding to the scientific naming and knowing with what she calls a personal, idiosyncratic and poetic alternative. This aims to be more neighbourly, she says, and more in relation between species. It involves knowing who we grow alongside. It is a process, a journey. She tells us she learns all sorts from the mosses. Mosses know about self-preservation. They know how to streamline and how to thrive on very little, how to whittle life down so that minimal effort is required from themselves. This, she says, I learn from the mosses, how to gather my needs in, to give without depleting. Science tells us much, but Burnett thinks that, and I think she shows us that perhaps on its own, it might miss out important features of knowing. Scientific observations of the mosses alone don't help in understanding what passes between us in our encounters. This is why Elizabeth Jane Burnett proposes that it is rather through moments of sensual attention, augmented by wider studies across different disciplines, including the scientific and historical, also including indigenous, ethnographic, political and cultural ways of knowing. It is through all of this that the poetic names suggest themselves. So this sensual attention, written through poetry, and the story of its writing in Burnett's book, this is how she names, how she knows. And during this process, as she puts it, the mosses may act on me as I act on them. So I think all of this, in conclusion, adds to the call for what Kimmerer has called a profound restoration, or the need for, as she puts it, a restoriation, which is a term she borrows from the ecologist Gary Nabhan. Our relationship with land, Kimmerer says, cannot heal until we hear its stories. Or as Job from the Hebrew Bible puts it, Job says, to ask the animals and they will teach you. Speak to the earth and it will teach you. To listen properly, then, I think we need to shift our thinking and learn in terms of relationality. Stories are holistic, so they are patterns, they are relational. They cannot be reduced to data or explained away, and listening to them takes time. Plato is not anti-poetry, but is a poet, a writer of likely stories. And throughout the dialogues, we see how myth involves collection. It brings together, it is holistic. It points us towards relationship, building stories with one another, spending time with one another, and perhaps with the moss. So stories do create, they relate together different, otherwise unconnected things, and they create a pattern. They are embedded in communities, and they also create community. Harnessing the power of story is therefore crucial for the development of holistic thinking. So there is your collection rather than just division. As the Phaedrus seems to suggest, stories are a charm by which we may enchant ourselves, either for better or worse, either as medicine or poison. And this means they have an unavoidably ethical nature. Our context includes the non-human world, and aporia encourages us to consider this non-human world as a partner in dramatic philosophical dialogue. In this way, I suggest we can understand stories not as fanciful reveries, or in Plato's case, a seemingly superfluous philosophical swan song, but rather stories are an imaginary exercise to envisage better relationships and a better future. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Louise, for teaching us, well, a lot about Plato that I really didn't know, actually. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd love to know what Plato would say to moss, but maybe you can answer that later on. We have about 25 minutes, but I suggest that we just take a break for a minute or two to top up our glasses, please, and eat more crisps. We've got lots left. Back in 1 or 2 minutes. So who would like to open the questions, please, for Louise? You have a question? Great, thank you. Oh. Well, wait for you to sit down. Great, okay. So this is the roving mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant, my name is. So I've got a silly question and a serious question. My silly question is, how on earth would you know whether a swan was telling the truth or not, right? And my serious question is, the difference between humans and animals is that one difference is that we have language and they don't, and stories involve the use of language. So how far is it possible to really integrate the perspective of animals when telling stories? If you're going to use a language which is clearly, I mean, could you only just say, describe this is what they did and maybe this is what they were feeling or something without language?
I think they're both important questions. I think we don't know in terms of the first question. I think that's the point, it's the aporia, we don't know. So it puts front and centre the limits of the knowledge that we have. So we should not just assume that we do know one way or the other. And I think, yes, the question about the speech is really significant. And I think it's one of the reasons why I'm quite interested in the way in which these arguments develop. Because obviously logos and mythos kind of originate from the words for speech. And then very early on with the pre-Socratics, it's the animals who are speechless, so they are the ones who do not have speech. So that then creates the divide between the human and the animal. And I think actually that is what's being challenged here, because we have myths where the animals talk. There are other myths where the animals actually engage in philosophy. So I think actually it is getting us to be a bit unsettled when we assume that stories have to include language, or it's a different kind of language. It's not really the language that we are used to, perhaps. So that's why I'm interested in Robin Wall Kimmerer talking about plants having a language. It's not one that it's easy for us to understand, certainly not from the context or the kind of culture that we come from. And I think it's fascinating personally how when you get sort of different approaches, particularly in oral communities, so indigenous communities, for example, would have a completely different approach to this. And as I said, the non-human world has always participated as co-storyteller because the language, human language, is not really necessary. So story is not limited to the human and the use of human language. Story goes much more, it's much broader than that. And yes, there's a certain type of listening, a certain type of attention needed to try to understand some of that story. And it is a difficult thing, I think, for us to do. But I'm not sure that story has to involve language. I think that's probably a shift to the textualization, that shift from speech to writing, really, that is going on there, that there is something lost. So in that shift from speech to writing, we then forget that the non-human world can participate and co-create those stories. We then go to assume that language, as we know language, is like that limits who can participate in that storytelling.
Thank you.
I'm about to pass the roving mic to Sean.
Thank you. Well, one of the things I wanted to say actually followed on from the previous question, and that's that we already know, or we already understand that stories can be told in a non-linguistic way. So think of pieces of music or pieces of interpretive dance. We already know that when you listen to a piece of music or when you watch a piece of dance, you can see that a story is being told there. So do you think our approaches to art can help us in our approaches to thinking about how we read the stories of the natural world, is the first question. And the second is, I wondered if you could say a bit more about the ethical implications of what you said for how we treat animals. How should we relate to them? If we're trying to understand their stories better, does that involve changing our behaviour towards them?
Yes, thank you. Yes to art, definitely. I think there is a way in which you could see aesthetics in general as playing a role here. And I think, again, you've got philosophy of aesthetics kind of going on right back to the beginning of this tradition, that art kind of helps us with that shift. And yes, perhaps overcome some of the limitations of seeing story purely textually and linguistically. So definitely yes. I think in terms of the ethical and the changing of behaviours, absolutely paramount. Yeah, that I think we often tend to focus in on like the individual things rather than seeing the relationships between them. And I think ethics is about those relationships between them. So it is a communal thing. And ethics kind of takes place there in the spaces of division, really. It's about our relationality. So I think this approach is about shifting our idea of what knowledge is. Knowledge actually happens in the relationships between things, and that is fundamentally an ethical question. So I think the ethics and the politics as well, you just can't separate them from that. And so yes, in terms of like the good story, bad story, like the two Elsies, you can sort of see the ethical contrast there.
Thank you. This is also a question about swans, whether it's serious or frivolous. I'll leave you to decide. What do we know about the status of swans in other ancient civilizations? And are there any clues in the Indo-European etymology to give us any hint of what their role was?
I don't know enough to answer the latter part of that question. I do know that swans do play an important role in a lot of the stories, say in indigenous peoples of what is now kind of North America. You have creation stories of swans, and also actually involving swans and care. So the care for humans. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think there's one story where the swan actually carries humans sort of flying through the air. So it's another reason why I got particularly interested in swans, actually, because I'm thinking, there are common perhaps themes here, interconnections that are made. So you have creation stories that involve an ethic of care, an ethic of relationality first and foremost. And yes, and stories in which the animals can teach humans things, and this idea that we can learn from them. So yes, from what I do know, I'm not an expert in this, but from what I do know, we do see some of those ancient stories with swans in particular, which is interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, I'm going to ask a follow-on question from that, which is a religious/theological question about. So I'm wondering whether your aim is to reverse the sort of instrumentalization of nature that has happened in Western culture over the last few centuries. And what I'm wondering about, and I know you use this phrase about cooperation with natural elements, non-human animals and so on, as part of the kind of discovery of their stories. And what that all put me in mind of was the point that non-Abrahamic religions, many of them do have a sense of the kind of sanctity of non-human animals. So there's the cow in Hinduism, for instance. Many non-Abrahamic religions have sacred trees, sacred groves, all these kinds of things, and about the sanctity of place as well. In fact, I mean, you can find traces of the sacred tree in the Hebrew Bible in quite a number of different places. So I'm wondering whether, are you suggesting that we kind of try to regain what has been lost over recent centuries, or is this something that's peculiar about the Abrahamic religions?
I suppose it's about the interpretation of those religions. So we were saying this morning about the motifs in the Hebrew Bible, for example, about nature. I think I'm trying to point the attention to the interpretation of, and that might actually highlight other things that are going on in the mix, perhaps politically, economically, ethically. So it's how these texts sacred texts and texts of, say, the Platonic tradition, how they actually get interpreted and reinterpreted. Because why is it that Plato gets interpreted as a philosopher that devalues the natural material world and promotes a hierarchy? Actually, you can see with that, and perhaps with the interpretation of Abrahamic faith, a development in kind of, well, Western Europe for kind of empire, and those sorts of things are going on in the background. So I think I'm trying to shift the attention onto the holistic system in which those texts are a part, to highlight why is it they've been interpreted in this way rather than that way. So my focus isn't so much like the text itself, it's more the reflection on how the text functions holistically kind of within that system.
Okay. Thank you. Any more questions? We have another few minutes. Oh, Sarah, I think you were first.
Thank you, Louise. I had a question. I was wondering if you had any ideas how to make narratives and stories embody the high context of the oral culture.
Yes, I think that's partly why I'm so fascinated by this, because we are a written culture, so we can't kind of go back on that. And so I think that perhaps by paying more attention to the problem is probably the best way to do it. It's almost, I don't know whether I'd want to go as far as saying it's like the least worst alternative, but we are where we are. And I think by perhaps continually thinking about the nature of story and thinking about the holistic in which it's in, and just thinking about that context, thinking about perhaps the pharmacon idea, where something can be remedy or poison. I think perhaps we focus too much on the thing itself if we focus on writing, and we just think, oh, if we just somehow got around the problems of writing, we could retrieve some of these ideas of an oral community. I think seeing things either as remedy or poison continually, like holistically in the context, and kind of holding that intention is perhaps the best way to do that, because then we have to think, is that remedy or is that poison? How is that thing actually functioning? So writing is further removed, but actually writing can be good or bad. It can be remedy or poison. Speech can be remedy or poison. Like artificial intelligence could be remedy or poison, like depending on the actual context in which it is a part. So I think understanding that holistic context then makes us better able to kind of predict things. So I think maybe by continually holding the remedy poison element of writing in tension, I think that's probably the best way to kind of retrieve some of those earlier insights and sort of understand what's been lost in that process of transition from oral to writing.
That's awareness sort of of both sides, basically.
I think so, yes.
Okay.
And kind of understanding that we might try and divide, but actually we're already kind of always holding things in tension. So yes, to focus on that holistic context, I think, is significant.
Thank you.
Thank you. I arrived slightly late, which I apologise, but you may have mentioned this, but just relating your swan mythology, I brought to mind Lohengrin, the Wagner myth, where the redeemer figure of Lohengrin is delivered to the person who is under stress and plight by a swan. And I was always been surprised by that, and how Wagner sourced that, and whether you see any relationship in some way to gospel stories of salvation and redemption with that imagery.
Yes, that's a great question. I don't know about Wagner. It's possible that this did come from the sort of ancient Greek idea, because obviously swans being connected to Apollo, maybe there is some kind of connection there. I think this is fundamentally theological. In terms of the kind of, theology of salvation and redemption, you were thinking, sorry, was that right, in terms of thinking that through? I think, I'm not sure, I'm still thinking about this, but I'm quite drawn to Celia Dean Drummond's stuff on story, I think because she has a clear role for kinship with the non-human animals. So I would want to see perhaps that salvation in terms of the way in which she would see it first and foremost. And I think I would want to see that again holistically in terms of our concept of Imago Dei, for example, perhaps more, as I think it's Chris Southgate says, more the kind of like custodian type of species. So yes, I think at the moment I'm sort of leaning towards her view of that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our time now, so please would you join me in showing our appreciation of Louise and her talk. Thank you.
Thank you.